at times I was the one that was answering the phone. At times, we were the ones, of course, that were going to open the doors. And at other times, it was kind of difficult. And it might be middle of the night that somebody is banging on the door. And because we had cars out front, so they knew somebody was there, but they're banging on the door and wanting to get into the food pantry or either high or drunk or whatever it might be, that you're having to deal with that, usually in your pajamas, in not the most Christian state of mind.
You're listening to The Glass House, a podcast that focuses on ministry leaders and their spouses.
Ben and I have lived in that glass house for most of our married lives, and it's important to us that we bring you tools that we wish we had. But not only that, we would love to hear from you. Email us at president@lifeway.com. We would love to hear your stories from the Glass House.
We're so happy to welcome Matt Henslee to the Glass House. He is now in a denominational role in New Mexico, but was a small church pastor for many years and has great things to say on a subject that we continue to get requests for.
So other than requests for episodes on kids, we get requests about what it's like to be in pastoral ministry in small churches.
Yes.
And so I think the most helpful thing we could do here is identify what is a small church.
And people don't know how many of them there are out there. Coming to Lifeway was an eye-opener for us, just the vast amount of churches that are small. We have stats on this.
I think this stat was eye-opening for me that I learned just this week even. So 11% of churches have more than 250 members.
Wow. So that blows my mind. 89% of churches have less than 250 people.
That is correct.
And that really shows you why there's so many requests for how do we do ministry in a small church setting.
Well, 57% of churches have less than 100 people. The majority of churches and ministry leaders are serving at churches of less than 250 people. And when I say majority, I mean 89%. That's a lot.
Matt is a great speaker on this subject because he's lived it. He knows what it's like to be a small church pastor. And I think some of the stories he tells and some of the pain points of being in a small church setting, as he talks today, a lot of folks out there are going to be like, yep, that's my church. Matt had several myths about pastors serving in small churches that were interesting to me. Mm-hmm. I needed to hear them. The first one was just that we're not dumb. The impression that because I'm serving in a smaller church, I'm not as intelligent as other pastors.
And he said it like that. We're just repeating him.
Yeah.
I mean, it was eye-opening the way he was just so honest about it. And the second one he mentioned, it said, we don't lack capacity.
Yeah, they're hardworking, high-achieving guys trying to meet goals and grow the church just like everybody else. Mm-hmm. And third one was, we are not being punished by ministering here.
Yeah, he said sometimes people look at him and almost as if they say, one day you won't have to be here in the middle of nowhere. And he loved it. He loved being where he was in Mayhill. Matt
Henslee has loved serving as a pastor of a small church, as do many who are listening. And today's episode is encouraging. Well, Matt, thanks for being on the show. We think there's some unique challenges that smaller church pastors and pastors' wives deal with. And since you've been living in that for so long, I could talk to us a little bit about some of the challenges that small churches face and their pastors and wives.
Yeah, for sure. For us, our previous two pastorates, we were on campus or across the street. And so boundaries just in terms of having your own place didn't exist because we were in parsonages. And so in one case, like it was nice to be super convenient. You could walk across the street or across the parking lot to go to church. In the other, when somebody leaves a light on or a door unlocked or needs to get in, you're the ones that got the call. And so there was really no break from the church. Certainly you were the ones that got the blame and that kind of deal if anything around the property is messed up or whatever. But that side of just the living side was a difficulty because we were the most available simply by location. And then when it comes to, of course, the ministry side, you kind of had to do everything in some measure, or at least be able to. In our case, we really work to build up a volunteer base and so forth. But being the guy that's there, opening the doors, turning on the coffee, doing all of that sort of thing, usually would fall on me because of just sheer convenience. But then that also meant that my phone was always on. I was always getting the calls, and I didn't do always well with having that boundary set of this is family time, this is our date day, this is our donut day. I did okay with that, but still there were needs at the church that would pop up, that sometimes those events would get shortened or whatever, just because of the needs of a smaller church.
Looking back, what do you wish that you would have said when people called that? Because it's hard to say to someone, I'm so sorry, it's my day off, I can't come help you. I mean, they don't understand that. And so what advice would you give to another pastor in that?
Now that I have Ben's number, I would just give them Ben's number and say, call him. No, my biggest advice would probably be there are emergencies, and those emergencies should be emergencies for a reason. And there's a reason that we would stop our day or we would get up at night to handle whatever an emergency is. But the tyranny of the trivial is usually something that we have to figure out pretty quick, especially in a small church, of just having that phone set on the do not disturb, or maybe it's a second call that's going to actually get through, where you're just not always looking down, oh, I missed a call from so-and-so, I need to call them back. Just being okay with picking it up tomorrow and catching up the next day, or when it was actually appropriate to do so, instead of in the middle of the dining room table or the middle of a date night for sure, or on your day off. That, if I could have done anything better, would have been just learning the ability to say no, and when to say no, and when to answer the phone, when to just put it on silent, and really carve out that time with my kids and with my wife. And a thing that I just learned about 30 minutes before we came on is the transitional AMS here popped in, and I said, hey, how would you answer this question? He said, I always put it on my calendar, a date night or a trip with the kids or a day off. And so if anybody asked, can you do something on blank? He always was able to say, I already have an appointment that day. And it just never dawned on me. And so it's kind of like, naming your couch visitation, that I'm on visitation, or naming your boat visitation, something like that. Like, I get it. But it also is a simple way to be able to look at your calendar, be reminded that this is important, having a date, having time with the kids or the ball game or whatever. And also having an easy out to say, I'm sorry, I already have an appointment that day. And can we reschedule the next day?
I would say, like, one of the things I've noticed in just hanging out with more and more smaller church pastors is the accessibility factor is so different than in other church sizes. I mean, recently I called a small church, to get a hold of the pastor, and the pastor answered the church phone. Mm-hmm. And so that's a foreign concept to a lot of pastors. And so, like, talk a little bit about what that's like, even having the parsonage right next to the church. I mean, there really is no separation of church and personal life. Like, it's all in one.
Mm-hmm. I don't know how to describe it other than how you just described it. It all just came together. Our family was at the church. Sometimes we would even be watching movies over there because there was a bigger screen in the church. Don't tell the neighbors. But
it was like a big fellowship hall for your family.
It was in the game room. I mean, it was like our house didn't have a whole lot of room and so forth, but we could go across the parking lot and be able to play ping pong or pool or something. Cool. And so it was kind of neat. But at times I was the one that was answering the phone. At times, we were the ones, of course, that were going to open the doors. And at other times, it was kind of difficult. When our location outside of San Antonio was close to a highway. And so a lot of times there would be kind of transient people either hitchhiking or whatever. And it might be middle of the night that somebody is banging on the door. And because we had cars out front, so they knew somebody was there, but they're banging on the door and wanting to get into the food pantry or either high or drunk or whatever it might be, that you're having to deal with that usually in your pajamas in not the most Christian state of mind. And so that was also a difficulty as well.
Lemley, one of the things that's unique about our story is that we have pastored in a large church in a smaller city, and we have started a church from scratch in a huge city. Mm-hmm. So we have insight to what he's saying here, in that, when we were pastoring a large church in a small city, I could not go into the grocery store and get out in 10 minutes.
Right.
You're going to run into 15 people, and you have to say hello. Right?
Of course. I mean, you can't blow them off. It's terrible.
Wear a hat and sunglasses and keep moving.
Well, I have done that before, actually.
I'm here to get Captain Crunch, people. Get out of my way. But when you go to a setting where you're maybe a church in a larger city, there is more anonymity. Mm-hmm. And what Matt is saying about always being seen, always being known, people know where you live, they run into you all the time, it does create some additional stress.
Well, they know where you live because half of them he was referring to are in a parsonage.
Yeah.
And how hard that is. I mean, so people not only know where you live, they know what your house is like on the inside. I mean, they feel like they actually have part ownership of it, and they technically do. But how difficult that is. I mean, I know that we heard about a story of a family living in a parsonage, and the air conditioning went out, and they had to wait for a committee member or committee meeting to decide if they could spend the money on a new AC. I mean, that's hard. That's really hard stuff to live through.
It's hard to go every place and know that people are watching you and know who you are. I remember a moment at Best Buy in Jackson, Tennessee. I was having a bad day. It's hard to have a bad day in a small town. And I was going in to get something, and the gal behind the counter was talking on her cell phone incessantly and was paying no attention to me. And about 5 minutes in, I was about to blow my top. And I was waiting for her to make eye contact, because when she did, I was going to let her know how I felt about this customer service experience. She hangs up her phone and says, "Oh my gosh, I love your sermons." And she went to our church. I didn't know her. And I realized I just about blew my whole witness with this girl because I was having a bad day. That's the pressure that Matt's describing. Mm-hmm. It's that, where can I go and have a bad day in this town? Everybody knows me. Well, one of the things that we're interested in hearing from you is some of the myths that are involved in small church pastoring. I think people who have never pastored a small church don't really know what it's like, and they hear things. And like, what were some of the things that you wish people understood about being a smaller church pastor? Like some of the negative things, but also some of the positive things.
Yeah, I think the first thing that came to mind when you said that was that it's not second class. That it's not terrible. It's not a step down. Going to a larger or a bigger city or whatever is not even necessarily a step up. It's, in my opinion, was quite awesome. And I love my friends that were in large churches. I love going to large churches. And I know there's some exceptions, but probably my favorite aspect of it that perhaps, and this might be, I would love to hear from you, might be a myth about larger churches. But for us, we were able to know everybody. Yeah. And there was a neat aspect as the role of a shepherd or a pastor to be able to, we talk about doing life together in small groups, all of that kind of stuff. But our families were all kind of one. I mean, we were going to, out to eat together. We were going to the parks together. We were, swapping kids. I never knew who was going to be spending the night at our house or who was at someone else's house. It just seemed like all the time we were all over the place. And so that aspect of that true community that we had, at least in Mayhill, was such a joy, because I felt like, we would average, I guess, about 140 to 160 people. And I felt like I deeply knew all 160 folks and knew what they were dealing with and they knew what I was dealing with. We truly were kind of one together. Yeah. And so I think it's not a second class. We're not generally, I can't speak, well, I can speak for myself. I'm not that smart, but we're not all dumb. We love it. It's great. It does have a slower pace, but it's not terrible. There's a lot of neat aspects of being in a smaller church.
Yeah.
What's interesting about this is that Ben just went to a state convention, and he said he was having lunch with a guy, and he had said he'd been there for 20
years in a church that ran about 150.
And Ben just asked him a couple of questions, and Ben said he was so genuinely sincere when he said, "I love it. Like, I just love it. I love being in that church." And it's so opposite of the American culture where, success means bigger and better. Mm-hmm. And, so it's just so interesting. Even pastoring, I mean, we find ourselves just wanting to still climb that ladder. And I don't mean that in a inappropriate way. It's just like you think, well, if I figured out how to do this small church, I could go to the next size, the medium church and the large. And so I remember he came home and said it was so refreshing meeting this guy who just loved his church.
Well, and I would say this. We planted a church in Denver, and those early years when we did know everybody were by far the most meaningful for me, because it really did feel like a huge family at first. Now, as the church grows and you begin to lose a sense of connectedness with every person that walks in the room, it has to change. And that depends a lot upon the population of the area and what growth is possible. But I would say like meaningful ministry is no respecter of size.
Yeah.
You can have a very like unmeaningful ministry in a large church, and you can have very meaningful ministry in a large church. And it's also true of small and medium-sized churches. So it really is no respecter of size. But I love what you're saying about that kind of family atmosphere that often happens in small churches that people don't realize how sweet that is.
Yeah, for sure. And for me, I think it was one of those where I think maybe the challenge was when I would see some of my friends that were about my same age or whatever, going from a church maybe my size and then to the next, and truly being able to be content in believing this is where God had us for life. Like I sincerely thought for so long that we were going to be in Mayhill and be buried right there. There was a cemetery right up the road. That sincerely was my thought. And then God had other plans and then took me out of the pastorate altogether in a different role. And that's had its own challenges. But even here, as I'm ministering with some of those smaller church pastors, I kind of have that appreciation of, the need for community, not just in our churches, but also when we're spread out. In Mayhill, the closest church to me was about 20 miles away. And so the closest pastor in my case was about 35 minutes away. And then one that I knew a lot or knew really well was about an hour away. And so I kind of have that understanding of the isolation that can creep in. Probably in a megachurch or in a small church, we can tend to kind of isolate ourselves.
Yeah.
But really pursuing these relationships with the pastors to say it's okay to be at Mayhill Baptist Church until you retire. It's not a second class opportunity. It's first class to be where God wants you to be.
So in your church, did you have very many staff members? Were your ministries led by volunteers? I'm asking that because I got an email just after Ben and I began this Glass House podcast from a lady who said, I would love it if you'd interview a small church pastor and ask him how he handled like volunteers in a really high capacity role, because this particular person had a full-time job, was also serving as the women's minister, and it was a really hard situation because she was being asked to do more than she could handle because she was bivocational.
I want to answer this two ways. That now with a kind of a different role, where I'm working in a sense 8 to 5 every day in a non-church setting, though it's still kind of church. It's weird. It's a weird, I think
we
you
understand.
might understand.
We get it.
We understand.
So, but then like on Wednesday, I realized that I have to get in the car, get in traffic, and then go to the fellowship meal and prayer meeting completely out of my own choice. I'm not paid to be there. I just get to be there. And there's times that I'm like, I really don't want to go. And I don't want to serve in this. I don't want to do this because I'm tired. And that gave me a renewed appreciation for the volunteers that we have that are working 8 to 5 in whatever area, whether it's even that mom that stay at home, she's still working 8 to 5, or really more than that, because there's kids, they don't just clock in at 8. So I realize that. And then we're asking them to lead in very critical areas of our church. And if we're not pouring into them and investing in them and giving them breaks and giving them really what we would call vacation in our context, then they are going to burn out. And so I have had now on this side of a regular pastorate a renewed appreciation for that now that I have to do that. The other side is, as a pastor, ours was almost exclusively volunteer. We had an administrative assistant that was also our finance secretary. So she was handling some of the budget, payroll, all of that. But everything else was volunteer except for me. And so our praise team was volunteer, our kids ministry, youth ministry, all of that. And we had all of those things. And because we had kids, we had youth, we had all of this. And so for me, what I found one of the best things that we did is, with my history in each of those areas, is I would just step in and give a break occasionally. And so we would just rotate where some would just have a day off. We also didn't have just one person in those roles. Maybe one was the director, but there were always some coming behind them that were being trained and equipped to do that role too, where we could say to, Joe, whoever, why don't you take, this month off and give so-and-so this chance to lead in this area. And so just rotating them in with our praise team. I'm a musician, so there was plenty of Sundays where we would just give the whole team a break, and I would lead or bring in somebody to lead. I think that's just something to remember, that we all generally in our jobs, in whatever job we have some form of vacation, either a day off or a week off or a couple of weeks off. And I think keeping that with our volunteers will go a long way to not burn them out. And then the other is recognizing them. You know, it's one thing if you're paid to do a job, and even, pastors that are paid to be pastors, we still have Pastor Appreciation Month and all of that kind of stuff, and encourage them with bonuses. And so for us at Mayhill, we would do the volunteer, basically of the quarter. We would do the Lord's Supper every quarter, because that's what God says to do, I guess, in Scripture somewhere. We would do that every quarter. And so when we did that, we would do the volunteer of the quarter and have a gift for them, either a gift card or a cross of, something, just to recognize them, because I think you also get what you celebrate. And so we would get to share what God had been doing in their ministries. You would see them just brighten up the moment they would, get their name called. And then, of course, with Christmas, trying to do some fellowships for them and pour into them, random gifts here and there, just little notes to say, hey, I see you and I appreciate you. And then regularly from the pulpit, just reminding the church that they might see me and think that all of this stuff happens week in and week out because of me. And that is a complete and total lie. It is because of this. And I would start pointing out the different people that are cleaning the church or putting out bulletins, and just start listing them and say it's because of them that we can do what we're doing up here today. And so I think recognizing, appreciating them openly, putting what they're doing in front of the church, often giving them breaks, will go a long way to keep them from being burnt out.
Ministry can be hard no matter what size church you serve in, but there are some unique pain points of serving in a smaller context. We've heard from 2 listeners on this.
Yeah, I heard from a lady, and I'm going to read it to you what she said.
Okay.
Lindley, I was a church leader mainly in the women's ministry area in a very small rural church. The pressures were so hard serving in so many roles in our small church, and made even harder because while my husband is a Christian, he does not attend church. During the years that I served on the pastor search committee, the stress was unbearable to the point of me having to take medicines just to be able to function properly. After God sent a pastor to the church, I ended up leaving that church for my own sanity. I hope that you will focus not only on the pastor's wife, but also the women serving in the church. I found a hard balance to not complain to my husband of the struggles, which only pushed him further from the church, which meant that I ended up keeping the stress inside.
So she was saying, I just got burnt out. So many things put on me inside the local church. I had to leave that church.
Well, but I think what she's saying too is don't forget that some people are serving in such high capacity volunteer roles that though they're not technically a ministry wives, they're essentially serving as a ministry leader for volunteer. And I mean, that's very hard to do.
If you're an eager, hardworking, high capacity person in a small church, they're going to put a lot of things on you. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of things to do.
And she had a day job.
Yeah.
So that was her thing. I mean, she just said, I could not balance a day job, a husband who felt a little bit differently than me about the church, and then all these expectations coming on me from the women's ministry. So I just like that she pointed out, don't assume that every high-capacity ministry leader is a spouse of a pastor in the church.
And, sometimes when I was a pastor, people would come to our church and say, hey, I just need to lay low for a while. Mm-hmm. I got just exhausted in my last church, and I just want to come and sit and get the music and the sermon and just heal for a little while. And that sounds like where she is. Mm-hmm. And we heard from another gentleman who sent us a note that said there are unique struggles that small church pastors deal with. To give one example, the podcast has mentioned repeatedly about the hurt associated with people leaving a church for another church. Have you considered the effects upon a small church when this happens? When a family leaves a small church, it could represent 5% of the entire congregation. And then they go to the bigger church in town that is thriving. This is one of the most difficult things about serving in a small church.
Well, and you and I talked about that email of how a family that leaves, I mean, think of the Mandrell family. If your church is 100 people and 6 of us who are serving, tithing, very active, if we leave a church, that's hard. I mean, an area lost 6 volunteers or they lost an extra tithe. And oftentimes when one family leaves a church, another family leaves a church with them. And so that's really hard when you begin to see a congregation dwindle, oftentimes because of a misunderstanding or different situations.
Well, I've served in larger churches and a small church plant. And when 2 or 3 families are gone in a small setting, even as a preacher, you look out and it feels less energetic. You can feel the gap. In a larger church, you don't feel that as much. And so the emotional toll that you feel as a preacher and a pastor is real in a smaller context.
I would say also the emotional toll. We may have talked about this one time before, but the expectations on you to pastor every single person. When Storyline was small, there's a lot of expectations on you to be available to every single person. And we had a family leave because you didn't meet her expectations. And that was really, really hard because we had our own family and our own set of issues going on, and we had no idea.
One of the beautiful things about being in a smaller setting is that the pastor knows everybody. He knows your kids. If something happens with your kid or you get taken to the hospital, he normally is the one to go and be there. As the church grows, it gets harder and harder. And for that reason, some people would prefer having a small church and get upset when it gets larger.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Because they really do want the pastor to be dialed into their kids' lives. I mean, I'll never forget the devastation of a lady, sweet lady, who came to me after a service to let me know she was leaving because I had not paid enough attention to her kids. And I felt devastated by that because I wish I could be a father to all the fatherless. But I couldn't be. I had to be a father to my own kids first. And so the expectations can be over the top, but at the same time, it's also the beauty of community, of being that deeply connected in a context together. Hey, 2 questions that we want to ask always on this podcast. It's about the glass house and how it's hard to be so exposed. You're working through your own frailties, your own difficulties, and all in public view. As you think about all your years of ministry now, what would you say is maybe one of the hardest parts about living in the glass house?
Being next door to the actual church house. That might be the biggest one. Sincerely, at Mayhill, I'm going to assume, looking at the notes or whatever, that this is the next question is to flip it. Mayhill was such a sweet time, and it did not feel like a glass house. I think it was implied, of course, it was at times, but it did not always feel like that. The kids were able to be kids. Rebecca was able to be Rebecca and not just straight pastor's wife and the kids, preacher kids, though they were. You can't, get away from that. But they were just really able to be authentic. But that wasn't always the case. At times, I think the biggest challenge I had or we had in the glass house was when positions were kind of buy one, get one free, where we're hiring you to do blank, but we also expect your wife to do this, and this. And some of those would even include playing the piano, and she couldn't even play chopsticks. I mean, It's just like, that would be probably for us that challenge. And that goes back also to boundaries of just, you're hiring me. And now we are a couple and we are a ministry family. And so there's roles that she will take on, but it's going to be what God calls her to do and what she's passionate about, not just this preconceived, this is what the pastor's wife is supposed to do. And so it hasn't always been like it was at Mayhill. And that was usually that challenge of, since Rebecca was the pastor's wife, then by nature, she's supposed to be the kids ministry director or the nursery director or the pianist or, the hospitality committee member, whatever it is, that we really pushed hard in Mayhill for her just to be Matt's wife, our kids, mom, and just a regular member of Mayhill Baptist Church. And she was able to do that and serve in areas that she wanted to and felt led to.
Can I ask you something about that? Just because I get a lot of questions from pastors' wives. What did she find was her niche at your church? Because I think there's this unknown definition of that they should play the piano or they should be the kids director. And so, did she find something that was different than that?
So it certainly wasn't the piano.
Me neither.
Rebecca loved the best way to describe it is making others just shine. She was the one that just loved either decorating. She would love kind of the behind the scenes stuff. She never wanted to teach. She doesn't like to really talk in front of people. And so she just loved doing all of the behind the scenes things, setting things up or decorating when we would have meals. Most people never even knew that she was the one that did it. but she absolutely loved coming up with a new design for each fellowship meal we would do and a new kind of theme. That was her favorite thing. And so that was her niche for sure.
I love that because, I mean, I can relate to her in that I am not a teacher. And so, Ben is an intellect and a teacher. And so people would come up and they'd ask me these questions and I'd have to find a really godly way to say, let me get back to you on that. I mean, it was hard for me, but I'm a doer. Like I love to do things and help and, work hard with my hands. And so, but that's not always celebrated. I mean, we celebrate the one on stage and the people who speak and teach in a lot of settings.
Matt, I've been listening really carefully to things you've been saying, and there's two things that I want to unpack just a little bit more. Earlier in this conversation, you said one of the myths, you said, hey, we're not dumb. When speaking about small church pastors, like, does it hurt sometimes that people speak condescendingly of small church pastors as if they're not as intelligent as larger church pastors? Is that what you meant by that?
I can't peg somebody that's ever, and I certainly wouldn't call them out. It just always felt like, in even some of my mentors, that, one day you won't have to be in the middle of nowhere. One day you're going to be appreciated for being, brilliant, blah, 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 and you'll move up. And I'm like, no. That's not the way. In fact, I think looking numerically, every church I served, I've gone the exact opposite direction. I think the first church I served as a student minister was larger than the next church I served as a kids minister, and then that one was larger than. You've grown smaller, and so part of me, and I'm like, well, I guess I can't get any smaller than Mayhill, and so it's like, now what? And so I just always felt this kind of implied sense of you're there because you don't have the capacity to lead blank, whatever big church or big city or whatever. And I don't think that's the way it is. I think we're not dumb. We're not, it's not like we lack capacity or whatever. And in some measure, I think it's, just as high capacity to lead something in that area because of how many things you're having to juggle. It's just a different nature. There's no lesser or greater. It's just completely and totally different.
I love what you said there. So it's not necessarily things that are spoken, but it's more little comments or suggestions that are made that, hey, maybe one day you'll graduate up to something more kingdom impactful than that small little thing you're doing out there. That hurts.
Yeah. And even, on Twitter yesterday, I shared I was going to a church celebrating their 155th anniversary. I didn't know where the church was. I had never even heard of the church. It was on our rolls. Couldn't have told you how to get there. And still, I probably couldn't. It was kind of off the beaten path a little bit, but 155 years. And I threw it out on Twitter. I was listed a couple of the names of the pastors. I didn't know who they were, but it's still in existence. And I was looking at some of the past ACP, how much money they've given to fund the Great Commission stuff that we do and all of that. And so I was just kind of reflecting on that when somebody replied and said, hey, 12 years ago, I was called to ministry in that church and have been serving ever since. And so it just gave a real reminder of, I don't have to know all of these churches that are out there, but God is still doing some of his most amazing work at a place like Prestonwood, just as he is at Pike, Baptist Church in the literal middle of nowhere, surrounded by steers. Like I got to see longhorns. That was great. I felt super Texan right then. Of course, I was taking selfies with it. But he's doing some of his best work out in the shadows that we have no idea what's going on, but he's calling people and awesome. They're ministering to them. And so I love it.
The other thing you mentioned I wanted to just ask you about is, I've never heard anyone put it this way, but the buy one, get one free package with pastors and wives. I know that's something that Lindley's passionate about. Like, it is hurtful sometimes when the pastor's wife is expected to work full time and not be paid when nobody has ever asked to do that anywhere else.
Yeah,
I know. Like
this is a big thing for me because I'm like, so bankers' wives don't have to, come in and shut down the bank at the end of the day, or, and the lawyer's wife doesn't have to come in and do some research. And so it's hard when you are kind of you are expected to do something, but you don't really know what you're expected to do. Yeah. And then people have an opinion on what you do or don't do. So it is one of those things to where that's what we talk about in the glass house. Like, you almost wish you could just hide because everyone has an opinion
or a lot of people have an opinion about what you should be doing.
And like the dumber comment earlier, it's like it's sometimes implied. Like in the search committee process, they ask something like, "How does your wife support your ministry?" And so like it's a fair question, it's a great question. Like, she doesn't support it at all. She hates that I'm doing it. Like, what am I going to say in that point?
I was going to say, but you said she doesn't.
Christmas and Easter.
Yeah. And so, she usually dresses up on Easter, but no, like that's usually it's implied in that. And so I'll usually answer like, she supports my ministry, one, by telling me that shirt does not match that suit, or something like that. Like there's ways in that making sure that the kids are able to do blank, blank, and blank so that I can focus on this. And then I usually use that as a point to tell the church that yes, she's a part. I mean, we're a family. So there are going to be aspects where there's overlap. But at the end of the day, our kids are going to be members of this church. She is going to be a member of this church, and she's not elevated or de-elevated or whatever. She is just Rebecca. And Rebecca is going to seek God's will for where she's going to serve. And unless, and I've said that before, unless y'all want to hire her to do blank. And if you want to hire her, then here's her expectations, here's job description, whatever. Like here, you either get it this way or you're going to essentially pay her. And so, and usually they don't want to do that.
Right.
And then you don't get the job. So it works out.
Well, we want to end on a high note here because it is a joy to serve in ministry. There are so many rewards. We can talk about the ills and the challenges all day, but like, what would you say are some of the sweet things that come with serving and living in that glass house? Why is it worth it, Matt?
I think it's worth it because God is doing infinitely more than we can ever realize. We will never know what kind of gospel impact we have on this side of heaven. I think sometimes we get glimpses of that, like at Mayhill, we had over 30 people saved in the few years that we were there. We saw a church in the literal middle of nowhere grow and do amazing things. So I was able to get some glimpses of that. But even then, I still only have a small picture of what God was doing in that season. And so I think what's worth it is knowing that you're doing something that you just can't really show a metric behind. But God is working in, through, and in spite you. You're right where He wants you to be, and doing far more than you could ever imagine through what seems at times is insignificant, at least in the world's eyes, but significant in God's eyes and for His purposes. I think that makes all of that totally worth it and joy-filled.
That's good. So let's pretend you got a small church pastor sitting right in front of you. He's discouraged. He's thinking about quitting. He feels like nobody puts a value on what he does. How would you encourage him today?
I would tell him a lot of what I've said today, of just he is seen. He is first known and valued, that his worth is not in the reach that he gets on Twitter or social media or the Facebook views or how many are even in the pews, but his worth is ultimately tied up in who Christ is and what Christ has done in and for him, and that just to stay faithful and trust God. If He wants to enlarge his ministry or move him, quote unquote, up, He will in His time, but just to remain faithful where he is and know that God is working, like I said, far more than he could ever comprehend.
Thank you so much for listening. If you're enjoying the podcast, would you consider leaving us a rating or a review wherever you listen to the show? It gives us insight into what you like, and it helps others find the show as well. The Glass House is hosted by Lifeway, produced and edited by Angie Elkins Media, original music by Robert Elkins, sound engineering by Dale Sandberg, and artwork by Cameron Spooner.